The title of our lecture today, exciting lecture, is Radical Displacements, Mobilizing Critical Physiotherapy in Practice and Research. To be delivered by no other than Barb Gibson. So Barb is a Professor Emerita in the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of Toronto. She conducts critical research and scholarship that aims to infuse disability studies into rehabilitation and the health sciences. Her work investigates the intersections of societal, cultural, and institutional practices in producing health, inclusion, exclusion, and identities with disabled young people. Her work is interdisciplinary and intersectional, drawing upon sociological studies of health, bioethics, posthumanism, and critical disability studies. Barb has over 100 peer-reviewed publications and has led 3 books that you can all see in your screen right now. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Barb Gibson.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey. And I want to welcome everyone here as well. And I really want to thank Patty and the executive for inviting me. I'm really honored to be your first speaker in this series. So let's get started. To begin, I want to talk about how this is both an exciting as well as a difficult time for physiotherapy and healthcare more broadly. It's exciting for lots of reasons, but for sure, our scope has expanded significantly, certainly over the course of my career. We used to call ourselves a multidisciplinary field, but now I would say we're a transdisciplinary enterprise. And we bring together really diverse disciplines, things as diverse as molecular biology or AI to critical race theory and posthumanism. So all of those efforts together are helping to move us forward to improve what we do and keep our eye on the prize of helping people to live well with diverse abilities. Now, we also know that this is a difficult time for healthcare, and it's for lots of reasons. But right now, in this moment, research, academia, social programs, as well as diversity initiatives are under siege. And it's because those old rhetorics of racism, intolerance, fascism, and so-called survival of the fittest which have always been with us, they're gaining global prominence again, right? So I think the importance of critical thinking and speaking truth to power is really urgent in the current moment. And healthcare and academia are definitely key sites for this work. I hope you'll agree that groups like us, like the CPN, are really important in this regard. So keep up the good work, everyone. And with those ideas in mind, I'm going to focus my remarks today on how critical physiotherapy can contribute to radical resistance and radical change. So I'm going to divide my comments into 3 different parts. In part 1, I'm going to outline different understandings of criticality and its implications. In part 2, I'm going to provide an example of critical analysis, and I'm going to use some recent research of my team where we explore the notion of differences as potentials rather than deficits. I will finish by exploring some really broad applications of a critical lens or more applied applications for reorienting practice, education, as well as research. Before I go on, I just want to make a couple of comments. I'm aware that while all of us here today are interested in critical physiotherapy, we may be coming at it from really different places, both in the world, but also in our academic or clinical journeys. And I'm very aware that at least some of you might be really early in your thinking, or may even just be critical curious, as I like to say, while others of you are much more seasoned. So I'm hoping there's something for everyone in my talk today. I've put in pieces that I hope for everyone. But I want to make the point now, and I'll make it again, that radical change requires radical modes of thought. So while my talk will be applied, I argue that theory and application always and necessarily go hand in hand. And hopefully I'm going to demonstrate some of the ways that we can do that, or that I've done it in my own work. Another note, the space where I work these days is called Critical Rehab Studies, or CRS. And I would say that includes physiotherapy, but you'll hear me talk about both. So just note that I'll talk about rehab as much as PT. Also note, I'm going to describe the images on my slides, and I'll do that for accessibility reasons. And finally, I want to acknowledge that as a knowledge producer, I am embedded in Western, settler, colonial, and ableist epistemologies. And so to that end, I'm aware that there will always be gaps in my thinking, both in my talk today, but in the work of mine that you might read, and that I probably do get things wrong from time to time. And this is what I call an ethics of doubt. So I want to practice what I preach around the ethics of doubt. So I very much welcome conversation, debate, and pushback about anything I say today. Okay, so let's jump in. On the slide, there's a cover image from the journal Critical Times, and it's an abstract painting of two women of color embracing. So what is meant by the term critical? And I start here because even amongst us critical folks, it has some fuzzy borders and variants, which can be exciting, but also a little bit frustrating. Well, we can start with what they have in common. All critical approaches to healthcare share a common belief that medicine and rehab are overly concerned with biological and physiological processes and do that to the exclusion of the social, political, and cultural mediators of health and well-being. In addition, all critical work attends to the effects of power, right? Critical means power. So pictured on the slide are cubes that spell out the words domination and limitation. And when we talk about power, here's where it sometimes gets a bit fuzzy. So I'm going to talk very basically about two very broad forms of power of interest in our critical work: overt and covert. Overt power we can think of as the power that one group holds over another, often understood in terms of power imbalance or power hierarchies or power dynamics. And it includes all those obvious ways, like by force or discrimination, that dominant groups oppress and marginalize other groups. So this is where we might talk about racism, sexism, ableism, etc. So critical physiotherapy looks at how these processes, which are often macro level processes, operate within physiotherapy and healthcare. We try to identify their sources and look at how they can be opposed. We can contrast that with covert power. Covert power takes the form of deeply entrenched discourses, or you can use the word assumptions or doxa. And it's those deeply entrenched ideas about what is seen as implicitly true, things that we think we don't have to think about. So the kind of core tenets of our work, ideas such as independence is always necessarily better than dependence, or walking is better than wheeling. So critical analysis would focus on exposing these kinds of ideas, how they operate, what are their hidden or unintended effects alongside their other effects, and exploring the possibilities for change. Now, both forms of power are of interest in critical work. You guys all know this already. Both operate systemically, and they both operate at multiple levels. So we can think of from that micro level encounter with clients to the level of policy, et cetera. So they definitely overlap in lots of different ways. Importantly, covert power is not necessarily oppressive or bad, right? The danger comes in unexamined assumptions. So I have a quote on the slide. I actually don't remember where it's from. I apologize. But it says, "We cannot assess the potential negative or positive effects an idea exerts without questioning its assumed truths." Okay, so that's an idea that comes from this guy, whom we all know, Michel Foucault, who's pictured on the slide. So I think a key point is that these two deliberately broad conceptualizations of power help to sketch out what we might collectively mean by critical, and maybe the two broad foci of critical work. There's probably more than two, but just speaking very generally. Critical work can be aimed at specific forms of oppression, like racism, like sexism, like homophobia, but it's not confined to those efforts. It's not confined to identity politics or to these overt forms of oppressive power. Rather, it can be applied even to those most mundane forms of practice. So that means that nothing is off the table. Nothing that we do is off the table. And so as critical practitioners, we question everything. And that's a lifelong process, right? What am I still taking for granted? What have I not seen? And sometimes doing that is the tricky part for people that are new to critical work. So this is my mantra for critical work. What are you doing when you're doing what you're doing? It can be applied to every level of practice, from the micro work with clients to formulating research questions, how you teach students, but also to wider initiatives at that level of health and social policy and even political movements. It requires stopping and thinking about what is taken for granted as common sense or just the way things are, or something I hear all the time. Well, that's how everyone does it. Okay. And instead, you force yourself to think about that things could be otherwise. And then the next step is asking how and in what ways. So, those two pretty simple ideas for me get to the heart of critical work. And they seem simple, but they're actually quite radical. And I think they're also a great way to start from in teaching criticality to people that are new to it, whether it be students or clinicians or anyone else. And it's because they are theoretical, but they're theoretical without being theory scary, right? They're simple statements that actually have profound implications. Okay, so I said I was going to say a little bit about critical rehab studies, or CRS. And CRS is a pretty new field of study. It's only been around for about 10 years. And I think all of us have a role to play in helping it thrive. So part of that is just naming it in our work. So whenever I do a talk, I try to name it so people hear that, oh, there's a thing called critical rehab studies. So I'm not going to set out a defined set of principles or methods for CRS. And that's because it's a critical field. It has to remain open-ended. That's the basis of critical work. And so we want to allow for innovation and diversity and growth. But there are a couple things we can say. So like all critical work, CRS investigates the taken for granted. It attends to power relations. It also critiques the dominance of positivism and other Eurocentric models of knowledge production. So we might think about neoliberalism or biomedicine or managerialism, things that pervade everything we do in healthcare. In its application in both rehab and physiotherapy, this is always going to include an imperative to end ableism. And my view is that rehab can and should be a site of radical change that works in allyship with equity deserving groups. And that includes and is maybe especially disabled people. And I say especially disabled people because of what we do. As an enterprise dedicated to addressing impairment and disability, PT and rehab have a moral imperative to help, or at a minimum, not to harm those for whom we provide care. So we can't begin to understand how to do that without working in allyship, without working in partnership with disabled people. I'm just going to say a little bit more about that. PT and rehab reproduce ableism even while striving to support disabled people. And that's because ableism operates systemically in healthcare, right? It's embedded in everything we do, everything. So our programs, our policies, our principles, our textbooks, our training programs, the funding mechanisms, assessment measures, huge, and the research questions that are deemed relevant. So once you start looking, you see it everywhere. We also know that normality is positioned in opposition to disability, which gets constructed as the problem requiring intervention. So many of us in the CPN have demonstrated this in our research, and it's also the primary critique leveled at rehab from disability scholars and advocates, right? This is a problem. We know it's a problem. But having said that, it's actually quite complex. So I definitely want to avoid demonizing individual practitioners or the professions in generally. We know that practitioners are embedded in the same disability discourses that pervade society, so it's everywhere. But more importantly, perhaps, normality is actually quite ambiguous, and it's constantly negotiated amongst clinicians and clients in rehab spaces. And there's been actually some really nice research to unpack what happens there. It is, however, dangerous to assume that normal is always preferable to different, or that sameness is better than diversity. So that means that thinking about disability differently requires effort. And that effort can be called epistemic reflexivity. And I'm going to come back to that term a couple of times. Okay, so with those ideas in mind, I'm going to transition now to the second part of my talk by presenting this example that I mentioned. So this is an example of critical analysis that aimed to radically challenge dominant discourses of disability. Specifically, we wanted to re-theorize disability through movement and re-theorize movement through disability. So really very much in keeping with the theme of the recent CPN book, which is fantastic, by the way. So the citation from a paper from the study is on the slide, and I'm happy to share any of the papers that I mentioned today. Our aim in the study was to challenge thinking as usual towards re-envisioning bodily differences as potentials rather than deficits. And to do that, we partnered with 5 disabled young people. We explored how their everyday mobilities are a form of what we call microactivism, that by just living their life, they're transforming the world. And I'll say more about that. And then we looked at the implications for healthcare. So before I go on, another caveat. Research, as we know, is always place and context specific. So this research was situated in Canada, which we know is a resource-rich and politically stable context. So I want to acknowledge that in other locales, poverty, insecurity, other forms of oppression can create a very different set of possible harms as well as possibilities. So that's always a tension in our critical work, and it's something we could discuss if people are interested. All right, on the slide is an image of 2 dancers and a wheelchair, and all of them are upside down and interacting. When we think about movement and mobility in relation to disability, they're most frequently discussed in terms of either bodily deficits or disabling access barriers or the interaction between the two. These approaches are constrained by what we call deficit thinking. So deficit thinking views bodily differences as problems that require remediation. And as of late, critical scholars have started calling for work that does not focus on deficits, but rather theorizes differences in the affirmative. So our study took up this call by reimagining disability and by using posthuman theory. On the slide, there's an image of a dancer who has amputations, and she's balancing on 4 stilts that look like horses' legs. In re-theorizing disability, we did not ignore the oppression of disabled people or dismiss the importance of political struggles to create enabling worlds. And it was actually to the contrary. We sought to come at activism in a different way, to use the power of art and theory to move discussion in new directions. So this can be called epistemic activism, which means theorizing in new ways to bring about change. Okay, so I'm gonna, just to introduce you to the study, I'm going to play a really short clip that just, it's from a film we produced from the study, and it's gonna introduce some of the details.
The Youth Mobility Project was a partnership between a diverse group of disabled youth, researchers, and artists in Ontario. Together, we wanted to challenge how disability is seen as a deficit and explore the idea of disability as potential. Disability is a form of diversity, and diversity is a strength. I am Danya, one of the researchers, and these are the 5 young people we partnered with. Each of them shared stories and images of how they move in the world. Here's Jen to say more.
This short film features our stories. We explore how we use our bodies in creative ways to express ourselves through music, poetry, and dance, to communicate new ideas, and to thrive through different forms of movement, mobility, and self-expression.
So that was super quick, and if anyone wants to talk more about the details of the project, I'm happy to do so. But I want to share a few ideas about posthumanism just to locate the concepts that we used in the study and that I'm going to be referring to. There are multiple strands of posthumanism, but what they have in common is that all challenge conventional understandings of humans and challenge those understandings of people as self-contained or ending at the skin, and instead consider the radical openness of bodies and people. So humans instead are understood as continually reconfigured through what we call an open system of assemblages that defy categorization. Okay, so we start to think about people in different ways. So those categories might be things like disabled and able-bodied, male, female, or even person, thing. So when I talk about assemblages, assemblages are constantly shifting connections between entities, and those entities are not include but are not limited to things like bodies, places, discourses, power, emotions, and material objects. Assemblages are said to connect and cohere, so they find each other, they connect through a force called affect. So affect doesn't refer to emotions the way it normally does, but to forces. You think of it as forces that compel these connections or movements or thoughts. So we can think of humans in posthumanism as a temporary set of connections that only have the appearance of permanence and solidity. They can be thought of as machines. I like this metaphor. A little machine that is made and plugs into other machines that produce different kinds of capacities. Some people don't like that metaphor. I really like it. Okay, one more term, becoming. So becoming can be understood as an affirmative life force, but it's not limited to humans. So affirmative doesn't necessarily mean positive in that conventional sense. It's more akin to an escape or a freeing from what has sought to contain it. So for example, in our study, this might include escape from ideas that constitute disability and disabled people in terms of tragedy. How else can we think about disability? How can we re-theorize disability in the affirmative? So I'm going to draw on these ideas. I know that was super quick, just to explore mobility as a more than human. Let me start over. I'm gonna draw on the ideas to explore mobility as a more than human enterprise, but I'm still going to keep the humans in view. So if that's fuzzy, it probably is. I hope it's going to become clear as I go through. So our post-human approach to movement understood it as encompassing the sensory, perceptual, affective, emotive, communicative, cognitive, physical, psychic, spiritual, and all other active and potential doings of bodies that ripple out in the world and have formative and transformative effects. It's a beautiful quote from our co-investigator, Avadna Kelly. So if we think about that, movement in this sense isn't limited to purpose-driven physical displacements, a different way of thinking about movement. It instead refers to flows of affect across human and non-human bodies and entities. And it can reborder or transform the world. Okay, so using that lens, bodily differences can be understood as forces of change, forces of potential, rather than deficit. So it's a lot of jargon, but if you think about it, that's a big switch, not only in how we usually think about disability, but how we usually think about movement. So in the study, our analysis produced what we referred to as movement experiments. And I'm going to share one of these. In this one, we considered so-called active and passive activities to instead locate movement in stillness, not instead, as well, to locate movement in stillness. So this is Dante, and Dante shared that he preferred indoor activities like making music on his computer. So we considered how in healthcare and society more broadly, activities like these are often indexed as passive and demonized, right? Demonized screen time, while so-called active pursuits are promoted as good or healthy. And we asked, what do those assumptions or discourses do or prevent? How is covert power operating here? So using our post-human approach, we considered stillness in terms of what we called virtual movement potentials. And to do so, we drew on the work of Erin Manning, who's a post-human scholar. And she states that the notion that a body moves without displacing itself means that rest becomes an instance of absolute movement. So if you think about that, along these same lines, there's no passive active distinction, but more profoundly, there's no movement stillness distinction, or at least not the way we usually think about it, right? So Dante's screen time can actually be reconceptualized as active, or what we call active passivities. Creating, making, and doing are affirmative movements that enable becoming. Okay, so let's stay with Dante. We can further trouble that active-passive distinction by considering different kinds of chairs. So on the slide are two images of Dante, one he's sitting in a wheelchair and one he's sitting in a roller coaster seat. So if we think about the wheelchair, that wheelchair is usually seen as a mobility chair, but it also something people just sit in like other chairs, right? So wheelchair sitting is both a position of rest and a position of dynamic activity, where the lines between rest and activity, passive and active, start to become blurred and perhaps no longer useful. So let's consider the roller coaster seat. So for Dante, that roller coaster seat affects a break in the wheelchair assemblage. The machine plugs into another machine, enabling other capacities and other events. Or we could say that the body reassembles and taking on a new relation to a new chair, to the roller coaster, and to the family members and strangers that are taking that same brief ride. Importantly, movement has already occurred in the stillness before that ride begins. And that stillness is filled with sensation and anticipation of pleasurable fear or speed. So as the ride begins, assembled bodies and chairs together take on the velocity of the roller coaster. So the roller coaster seat is another moving chair, but not coded as a mobility device like we would code a wheelchair, right? And it's different. Getting to another location is not the point because there's no other there to go to. Instead, it plays a different game. Movement for movement's sake, for pleasure's sake. Actively passive bodies are transformed, formed differently, becoming speed, fun, fear, and adrenaline. All right, now at this point, you might be saying, so what? So what? Well, the point I want to make is this. Critical analysis is activist in that it uses that power of theory to challenge ableist practices that engender standards for what becomes so-called acceptable forms of activity. In my example of Dante, the body, person, chair movement assemblage that we call Dante is alive with possibilities. That demonized screen time or a roller coaster ride can be seen as modes of becoming, wherein objects, ideas, bodies, sounds, motions, places together are enlivened to produce joyful doings. Or said differently, these active passivities offer resistance to the imperatives of what constitutes right and proper activity. So I hope you can see that the applications to physiotherapy are quite extensive. How do we assess activity in our practices? What advice do we give? How do we support people to feel good about themselves and their modes of expression or joy? And when I say we, I'm including physiotherapists, but also any clinician, teacher, coach, friend, family member, policymaker, etc. And that's because these discourses are pervasive and they require a collective effort to counter. How can we think about these things in very different ways? So that's where the activism comes in. And I said it was also radical. How so? Well, again, my point is that epistemic activism speaks to these forces that seek to homogenize or normalize or suppress difference. And those kinds of actions are especially problematic when they're done in the name of healthcare. So what does it mean for healthcare? Well, we can ask these kinds of questions. What can this assemblage produce that affirms becoming life? What can we create together, meaning clients and clinicians, but also what else is available? What capacities or capabilities are available? Or what powers can be mobilized? Or how can life go to the limits of what it can do? So those questions might be a little too open-ended, not applied enough for some of you. And so I'm going to move away from the study now. And I'm going to, in the last part of my presentation, talk about some perhaps more direct applications of critical work to research and practice. And before I do that, I do just want to acknowledge our partners in the study. And there's a link on the slide that is a link to the film. The film's about 10 minutes if anyone's interested in looking at it. Okay, so let's think about practice and education. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that probably the most significant or lasting change we can make to practice is at the level of training. Training in what? Well, training in critical rehab studies, in disability studies, in anti-oppression, and we want to do that for our rehab students, for our rehab practitioners, for our managers as well, for postgraduate and graduate students, etc. Like, let's train everyone. And within that, we want to question these medicalized outcomes and measures that are used in policy and in practice. What are you doing when you're doing what you're doing? And to create space for advocacy for socially just policies and funding, both locally and globally, and with our community partners in every instance. As an example of training, I thought I would share with you what we're doing in the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of Toronto. We have implemented a SPEC curriculum. SPEC stands for Social, Political, Ethical, and Cultural Dimensions of Health and Healthcare. And the primary objective of this curriculum is to teach students skills in what we've called critical reflexivity instead of epistemic reflexivity, because we don't want to freak them out. And so we teach them critical reflexivity in relation to 3 pillars. Disability is the first one, then healthcare practices broadly, and finally axes of oppression and EDI. And we developed for that curriculum this framework, which we call the AEA framework, Assumptions, Effects, Alternatives. And they use it to identify those assumptions that are embedded in various aspects of physical therapy, the hidden or harmful effects, and to think about possible alternatives. And I'm happy to share that or anything about the curriculum if anyone's interested. I would really love to hear what you guys are doing in your own practices. And so what about practice? So when I was thinking about this for the talk, I thought maybe I'd start the conversation, I'd share this project that we did. And it was a study we did a few years ago where we trained clinicians in critical thinking, epistemic reflexivity, to examine their own practices. So on this slide, there's a masthead of 3 of the published papers from the study. You'll see in that middle paper was led by the wonderful Patty Thill, who was very engaged in this research and actually led a lot of aspects of it. So for the project, we partnered with 2 clinical teams over the course of 3 years, and we taught them skills in epistemic reflexivity, as I said. We worked with each team to explore their assumptions, conventions, and the embedded norms, covert power, that govern their daily work. So the goal of the study was to help them identify and directly implement meaningful change. And I said, help them identify. Importantly, the team drove those changes. It wasn't us saying you need to change this. They had to decide themselves and identify it themselves. So I really like this beautiful quote from Anne Kinsella, who's a colleague in Canada. And I think it sums up our approach. So she notes that through reflexivity, practitioners begin to crack the codes, to consider together the invisible cloud that pervades everyday life and everyday practice. And from this location, envision new possibilities together. So that's epistemic reflexivity. It's what we taught the teams, and it became our shared method to look at clinical practices. Super quickly, this is what we did in the study. We did observations of clinical practices where we were embedded within the practices. We interviewed the clinicians as well as clients, and in this case, it was parents and children. And then we analyzed that data and fed pieces of it back to the clinical team through a series of facilitated dialogues. Those, I'm going to say a bit more about the dialogues. Those dialogues were spread over 3 years, as I said. They were always led by an experienced facilitator. So Patty was a facilitator, Jenny Setchell, some of you know, was a facilitator, and so was I. And we included a number of different exercises to help the team to think reflexively and deeper about what they were looking at. So these might be things like we would give them a data excerpt and they'd have an individual reflective writing exercise to do about it. And then they would share what they found, or we gave them some questions that we call provocations for discussion. And one of those, the first one on the slide is, what is the purpose of the clinic? And at least for one of the teams, that was actually quite profound. I wasn't expecting it, but they all had an answer, but they said things like to improve the quality of life of children and families. And then when we said, well, what does quality of life mean in that context? That generated loads of discussion. So it was really, really valuable. Importantly, I'm going to say this again, they were told they were not being evaluated by us. I don't think it would have worked otherwise. They were looking at their own work in terms of what could be different, but also, and again, importantly, we celebrated what they did really well. And they, again, identified that it might have been some people were doing some things that other people didn't know about it. And they said, hey, that's great, I'm going to do that too. And the end point was to identify what they could and wanted to change within their own practices. So the teams produced more than 30 recommendations across the 2 sites, and they included everything from how do I want to change my individual practice to team processes, what do we want to do as a team, to upskilling, what do we need more training in, and even potential institutional changes that they could bring up to management. And so the slide just gives a sense of how we organize the links between the issues, so the principles that were in tension, and then the plans to move forward. Okay, so that middle column was important. What are the things we're taking for granted that are in tension here? And the nice thing about the study was that they really did implement many of these changes. But we also all agreed that developing of that skill of epistemic reflexivity was likely the most important thing going forward. So I'm hoping you can see in the study, this is what I was going for, that there's a nexus of theory. So learning epistemic reflexivity and criticality, learning that skill, how do you actually see it? How do you do it? And then the application, what would we actually change in practice? All right, I'm gonna wrap up. I hope there was something for everyone in the examples of critical work I've shared. I know some of those I went through really fast. I just want to say that I contend that there's a place in our shared work for all kinds of critical thinking and critical doing. So we can do that deep theorizing that we might see in posthumanism, but also really entry-level approaches to critical thinking, like teaching students and clinicians to think about what are you doing when you're doing what you're doing. All of this stuff is important. It all works together, and it has really important implications for our practices, for how we educate students, and for the research that we do. And I know I'm largely preaching to the choir that you guys know all this already. So I'm really looking forward to having a dialogue and maybe even hearing some of the stuff that you guys are doing and your struggles and successes. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you again for being here, and thanks again to the CPN for having me.